In a slight review, I noticed that one of my immediately preceding statements doesn't make sense. It's an error. I was talking about there were signs, that literally said don't talk, or it said shh, you know, the walls have ears. I think I said the ears have walls. Well, anyway, I'm now correcting that. It was the walls have ears. In other words, don't ever speak, you know, war business or orders or locations or anything else like that unless you're in the proper place to talk about it. Incidentally, I said then that I finally received my orders to join my people in London. I was very lucky there. Again, there were no quarters, of course, available because I was going right into the heart of London. In fact, our offices there were in a very, very swank building right in Grosvenor Square. And if you've heard anything about London, you know that Grosvenor Square is one of the better locations in London where the rich people have their hideaway apartments, etc. As a result, I was quartered in a very fine hotel in Grosvenor Square. Had maid service, the works. Ate in the dining room for all the while I was there. And we were there only because our headquarters was being built by the British, and they weren't quite ready. But it wasn't too long. They were ready, and they were all brand new brick buildings, quite a big complex, which then, of course, was 8th Air Force Headquarters. So when we moved there, I was assigned to a barracks, a regular wooden barracks. In fact, some of them, they even, I understand that, I should say, first of all, that these were located in a park. And my understanding is that during World War I, they were used, I think, by the Canadians, some missionary service or something, where they billeted children to keep them safer than some other locations, or some such thing as that anyway. But, before I ever left for overseas, my colonel told me that as soon as he was able, he was going to give me a direct field commission as a second lieutenant. Well, then he told me he'd better wait a while yet, till we're overseas and so on. So anyway, we finally got settled in our new headquarters buildings. And like I say, I was assigned quarters in one of these older barracks. And I don't know how long it was, but my colonel called me in, and he says, "Cliff, I was then a staff sergeant, as I told you earlier. Well, the next rank is technical sergeant, and then the next rank is master sergeant, and that was the highest enlisted rank at that time." So he called me in, and he said, "Cliff, I'm going to make you a master sergeant." He says, "I've talked to your commanding officer. You see, my colonel, my people I worked for, they were my bosses while I worked. But for administration purposes, to get rations and quarters and that sort of thing, I belonged to a headquarters company, and it had its commanding officer. So I was really one of his men, but I was working for these other, top brass." So my colonel went to that man, who was a major, said he wanted to just skip tech, make me master. So the major said, "Well, Colonel, I'd like to do that for you," he said, "but it might cause trouble because there's men here that have been technical sergeants. They've been waiting for their master. And if I shoot this man right from staff to master, it could cause some feelings, So he said, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll make him tech for 2 weeks. I'll publish the orders. And then 2 weeks later, I'll publish the orders making him master." Well, I was told this on the side by my colonel. He says, "Just wait for another couple of weeks." So I never did get tech sergeant chevrons and have them sewn on my clothing. And sure enough, 2 weeks to the day, appeared the order making me a master sergeant. Well, then, of course, I had already purchased the the stripes, and had them, took my clothes to the tailors and had them all put on, you know. And even then it did cause some trouble. Some of the older techs wouldn't talk to me for a while, you know. But anyway, he said, and don't worry, I haven't forgotten my other promise. Now, we'll wait a little while yet for that, see. So, what my job was then, I was chief clerk of the ordnance section of the 8th Air Force headquarters. Oh, I had quite a number of people under me. I had an office with a civilian female British secretary, and I was under the immediate control or command of a very fine captain. He's the man that I basically reported to, unless I was called in by the colonel or something like that. But he was a very nice fellow, and this woman was marvelous to me. Oh, she tried to always get me to come over for dinner and that sort of thing. Of course, I wouldn't do that because, you know, she was sort of up to no good, but she's very nice, and I hated to do that to her, but she was just heartbroken every time I'd say, well, gee, I really can't make it, you know. But, and I'm not patting myself on the back, but it was an embarrassing situation for me is the reason I mention it. Now, even during a war, when you're overseas, once you become a master sergeant, you can request permission to live off the base. And you have to ask your headquarters company commander about that, the man that's in charge of you for rations and quarters. So as soon as the orders were out making me master, I went to him and I, Major, I'd like to request permission to live off the base. And of course that man never saw me because I was never in those barracks. He didn't know me from Adam. Even when he published the orders, he didn't know who I was. So he said, "Who are you?" And I told him. Oh. He says, "Oh, yes, you know." So without any further ado, he says, "Yes, I'll give you written permission right now." So I went and I rented a room with a very fine elderly English family. Nice little cottage on a nice quiet street. I should say quiet except for the German bombers and our own ack-ack to shoot them down. But anyway, they were a lovely old couple. They were very, very old, and they would never tell me how old. I used to kid them about it. In fact, they had 2 old maid daughters that were at that time over twice my age. And they both, their life's work was playing in the London Philharmonic. They played stringed instruments. And their daughters played as well. So many evenings, you know, when I'd come in, they'd be in the living room there having a little concert. I used to listen, and we got along great. And believe it or not, every morning I'd hear these soft steps, you know, coming up the stairs because my bedroom was upstairs. And here'd be the old man with a tray, a pot of tea, and some crumpets or some kind of biscuits or rolls, you know. So I had, you know, tea and crumpets in bed every morning. And I told them, you know, I didn't want them to do that. They says, no, 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 you never mind, you know. And every evening when I'd come home, you know, I'd go into my closet, get a fresh shirt or something, or a fresh outfit. If there'd been a button missing off something, or if one of my socks, if there'd been a little hole, I'd find the button sewn on, I'd find the sock darned, I'd find everything in order, everything pressed, you know, shoes shine, the works. British are like that. When I don't know if they still are, but whenever you visited and stayed overnight, they'd come in your bedroom, take your shoes and your trousers. In fact, the first time it happened to me, I thought I was being, you know, rolled. But they take your shoes and they shine them, take your trousers and press them, and then softly tiptoe back in and lay them out very carefully. That's part of their hospitality. But I really enjoyed living with that family. And of course, sometime during the war while we were overseas, all of the rolling stock, that is the trucks and so on, used to be under the Quartermaster Corps of the Army. But for some reason they changed it to ordnance, and they turned that whole responsibility and operation over to ordnance. And of course, believe it or not, part of that rolling stock included bicycles. So being in ordnance and being a master sergeant, naturally I had myself a bicycle issued to me, and that's how I used to get back and forth, from the house to the headquarters and so on. So all in all, that was a very nice experience there, and like I say, I had a nice job. Worked hard, and it was exacting, but like I say, having a private secretary and a private office and a little prestige, a little you might say a little power, I guess, being the top boy in that section, it was nice, let's face it. But then something happened. Well, before I talk about that, though, I should say that, there was this very, very strict blackout in London. There had to be. So sometimes I'd get to a pub that was off the beaten track. I mean, it was some distance from my camp. And the buses stopped running at 10 o'clock, and that was the time the pubs closed. And if you didn't get right out of the pub and get the last bus, you were out of luck. Well, sometimes, especially if there was no moon, man, I did not know where I was going. I'd even have to feel with my feet for curbs so I wouldn't trip and fall. You couldn't light a match. If you had a little penlight flashlight, the only time you could use that is if you pointed it straight down for a moment to find something or something like that, but you couldn't, show any light anywhere. But on many of those occasions, I'd hear footsteps, and I'd stop, and then they'd stop, and then they'd proceed again, and then I'd hear a voice saying, hello there, hello, and I'd say hello back, and it would be a British couple usually. And then they'd catch up to me where I am. They'd have their little pen light, and they'd say, where are you headed, Yank? And I'd tell them, and I'd say, oh my God, that's such a distance that you'll never find it in this dark. Well, they'd take me right home with them. Perfect stranger. Give me a bedroom. Like I say, they'd shine my shoes, press the trousers, and I was embarrassed many times. They were rationed to about 1 egg a week or a month, I forget which it was, and fresh tomatoes, they were almost out of the question. And yet every time I was at a house like that, for breakfast there would be an egg and some fried tomatoes to go with it, and I wouldn't want to eat it, but they'd insist, so naturally I ate it. But that was the early part of the war. Naturally, as more and more troops came, you always get the bad with the good, and then, things always change. They always do. It's a pity, but incidents occur, and then maybe you're not thought of so well for a while, But anyway, I liked the English people very much. I enjoyed seeing the sights of London. Actually, my headquarters was really what you'd call a borough of London. It was really, you might say, almost a part of London. And I shopped in their finest department stores, and I used to go to their finest barber shops. When I say a barber shop, it's not like our barber shop. It was like in Selfridge's or their big department store, where you walked in and a footman greeted you and took your coat off for you and seated you, and they did your hair, and they'd give you they'd finish it off with a singe, and I used to get manicures and the works, and they treated treated you like you were nobility or something, you know. Naturally, you tipped them, and that's. But it was really. I got a little taste of what it might be like to have a little money, and believe me, brother, it's not bad. Oh, what a come down ever since. But anyway, this will, of necessity, have to sound fragmented because I think of things as I go along. When we first got to London, we were greenhorns, you know. War was almost like a big thrill, you know. I mean, the travel, the meeting people, even watching the German bombers like idiots. We stood there out in the open and watched the bombers at night and watched the searchlights, get them in their beam, and watch the tracers going up from the anti-aircraft batteries. Right out in the open like idiots. Until one night a stick of bombs fell damn near on us. I hit for the weeds, and I hit a mud puddle, and I got mud head to foot in my spanking clean uniform. And a couple of those bombs hit some of our barracks right next to me and killed a few of our people. And from then on, you know, we went into a shelter. Before that, we didn't have sense enough. We were watching it like it was a show. But it was a real thing, we found out. Hank, I truly hope you don't get bored with this because I've been talking quite a while already, and I haven't nearly covered all of it. And, well, there's a lot to say, really. I keep thinking of things as I go, things that I've neglected to say in the sequence in which they happened. But I hope you'll bear with me. I'm not accustomed. I haven't, you know, made a tape in a long time. And incidentally, I'm doing this on a small portable, so I don't expect the sound quality to be very good. But I do have a big, you know, powerful tape, or I should say cassette deck that goes with the rest of my stereo equipment, but I've never set it up. It's still in the box, brand new, and maybe one day I will, and I would get much better sound on the tape, and then you would get much better reproduction, but you'll have to be satisfied with this. And like I say, I'm going to continue even at the risk of being over talkative. But these things, you know, as I think of them, I suppose until I become so senile or whatever, I'll always think of them because it was a chapter of my life that I would have to say was really the most interesting and most satisfying. Well, to get back with it, oh, while in London and even later, I made a lot of fine contacts. I met some royalty, I met some very wealthy people, and London is great for private clubs, or at least it was, and that's where you could really get a good meal and good drinks. That was much different, you know. If you ate out in a restaurant, you don't know if you were getting horse meat or what, and supplies were limited. You know, they were at war, and as I mentioned before, it's an island. But anyway, I managed through influential people to get quite a few memberships to various private clubs, and that's where I spent most of my time. That's where I did most of my eating and most of my drinking. And of course that was, I should say that was more especially true after I was commissioned, that I got most of that. But I had a little bit while I was yet a master sergeant. But anyway, I met a lot of fine people, made a lot of fine friends, been entertained a great deal, even, you know, been invited for the Christmas holidays to various people's houses, And I did get in, however, on a little bit of the blitz, you know. I had a few scares. Anyway, to continue on with my own experience or the role that I played, what my job essentially was to keep a flow of essential materials, that is, in the right quantities, from the United States to the British Isles, to keep our aircraft well supplied with the materials necessary to carry on a successful war, and that's what it was all about. I sent many a cable to the War Department in Washington and so on, important places. And of course, as with anything else, as the car manufacturers run into problems with their new products, you run into problems with your equipment. Sometimes you run into problems with a particular target that your bombs won't penetrate, so you have to develop a new bomb, a new type of a bomb. We had some trouble in the early years of, I should say, the early attempts at bombing missions, with our machine guns freezing at high altitude. So you had to develop a different lubricating oil for the guns and so on. That was all handled by ordnance, all that type of thing, and developing new types of equipment that would do the job better, the job you were already doing with the older equipment. And it was very interesting. Now, as luck would have it, incidentally, while I was at 8th Air Force Headquarters, I saw quite a few celebrities. I saw Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart and Gene Raymond and Daryl Zanuck and, oh gosh, I don't remember them all now. Later on, when I was commissioned and got with the 9th Bomber Command, I used to drink in the same bar with Van Heflin and Robert Preston, a few others I can't recall right now. But anyway, what I'm leading up to is this. After things, after a while after we were there, well, when you're expanding a war, you have to keep developing, you keep getting more manpower. That's the purpose of a draft. You create new divisions of infantry, new divisions, or whatever they call them, what do you call it, the armored cavalry, the tanks, and likewise with air forces. When the war spreads, you create new air forces to send to a particular area. Well, while I was there, a new air force was created for the North African campaign. And just like with a manufacturing company in the States, like General Motors, when they open new factories, they have to take certain key personnel from some of their existing factories and send them to be the nucleus of the new factory. They have to send old experienced hands, so to speak. Well, they did that with my people. In other words, my two good colonels were transferred to a newly forming Air Force again for a job on the other side of the world, you might say. And I liked those people so well. And the colonel's secretary, which was a male soldier, was my closest buddy over there. He was going also. My two good colonels and him. So I went to see my colonel. And I said, please take me with you, Why are you leaving me behind? He said, Sergeant Mormon, we can't take you because we have to leave you here because they need you here. We can't take every key person. And he said, look, I thought it over a great deal. I even tried, but I couldn't do it. We'd leave too big a void here. So naturally, when key people go, you got to get new ones in, and you got to leave some. So anyway, my people went and I stayed. Naturally, we got a new colonel, new head man. Well, he was very much the opposite of my dearly beloved colonel that I lost. So when he came in, his first day, we had one lieutenant there that was, well, he later became a captain. He was also an enlisted master sergeant, promoted, through like I was. And he was our personnel officer. So this new colonel, this was quite a large office we were in. He walked down the center aisle, and at each row of desks they would stop. And the personnel officer would point at each individual and say, that is Lieutenant so-and-so, his job is such and such, he does this or that. See? And then that is Corporal so-and-so, he does this and that is Sergeant so-and-so. Well, anyway, they got to where I was, my office, and the fellow explained to him, that's Master Sergeant Mormon, and he does this and that, Well, this colonel glared at me, and he went, too young to be a master sergeant. And they walked on. I thought, uh-oh, what do I have here? And I could see right away that my direct appointment as a commissioned officer went right out the window. So, one night, I had the boldness enough to, after working hours, he was still in his office, knocked on the door, and after a curt come in, I told him how I was promised a field commission and so on, and he said, is that so? So what makes you think you ought to have it? And I don't know what I told him, but anyway, I told him something. And I said, I think that really, if nothing else, I request that you put me in to be at least a warrant officer. Well, that's really not a good grade. I'd have been better off as a master sergeant, but anyway, I threw that in. And he just kind of looked at me and grinned and said, well, something to the effect of, don't bother me with this type of thing again, He says, I have my fingers on the pulse here, something to that effect. I don't know what it was. But anyway, I knew I was cooked. So it so happened that an order came out stating that due to the large and sudden increase in air traffic in England, which is really small land area, they had a dire need for flight control officers because you had to have a strict system of controlling aircraft in flight to avoid collisions and so on, because as I say, it was a small land area to support so many aircraft flying over it at a time. So I saw that thing and I said, by golly, I'm going to apply for that. So I made application, and this personnel officer, incidentally, who was very poor when he was in the States when I first met him, always broke. I always loaned him money to feed his wife and his daughter. His wife was Polish and she spoke a little broken, but she was a very nice person. His little daughter was a doll. He was a master sergeant at the time. And when I got to England, I was still a staff sergeant, and when I met him, when I arrived there, he'd been in the meantime promoted to a first lieutenant. Now, he'd previously been a principal of a high school or something before he went into the service. He was an educated man. But just to show you what a stinker he was, when I walked into that office and my two colonels were there, they both got up and rushed over to me and shook my hands and said, "Sergeant Mormon, damn, we're glad you finally got here, you know." But this guy stood very formally and said, "Good afternoon, Sergeant Mormon," you know. Well, in other words, the commission went to his head, I guess. And I understand he deserted his wife and child because I guess he felt that she wasn't up to his standards since he was then a commissioned officer, you know. I don't know how far the man ever progressed because I lost track of him. But anyway, this fellow told me when he saw me put that application in, he says, "Look, you can put that in if you want to, naturally," he says, "but there's no point in it. You might as well tear it up." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you'll never make it." I said, "What makes you think so, Lieutenant?" He said, "Well, I have a brother-in-law in the States. He was a college graduate. I forget what his work was." He said, "He tried it there. He failed." I said, "Well, Lieutenant, if it's all the same to you, I want this to go in." So he let it go. And orders came out, they were published, for certain people to appear before a reviewing board on such and such a date at such a place, on, you know, and my name was on it. So this lieutenant went to this colonel and he said, "Say, I better tell you that Sergeant Mormon has applied for his flight control school." His response to that, as I learned later, was something to the effect of, "Oh, don't bother me with such trivia," and when I just dismissed it and went on about his business, you know. So anyway, I appeared before this board, and they were all, of course, high Air Force brass, and I think maybe a couple of doctors. And right at that board, they eliminated, oh gosh, anywhere from 60 to 75% of the candidates. Well, I survived that board. The orders came out then, and of course you don't know if you survive at the time. You wait till the next orders come out. Well, the next orders came after a bit, that the following name personnel will report for reviewing board at such a place, etc., and my name was on it. That meant I passed the first board. So I went to the other one. And by this time, you know, this lieutenant was getting a little worried, and he went to the colonel again, and he says, "Say, Sergeant Mormon passed that first. He's in line for another review now." He says, "Look, don't worry about it. I won't let him go. I'll stop him." Something to that effect. He just said, "I won't let him go." And I guess the colonel would have had the power to squelch that, you know, if he wanted to, I don't know. But anyway, I appeared before this second board, and again, you didn't know how you made out till the next orders were published. Well, they eliminated another percentage at that, and I still survived. I had to go before the third one. Well, then they were getting real anxious, and you know, they were getting worried that maybe I would make it. Well, the outcome was, as you know, that I did make it. My worry then was, would I be stopped? Soon the orders transferring the successful candidates to appropriate stations for training would be issued. And of course, I was very anxious. At first, I had put on this tape the details of how I managed to get from my headquarters without being stopped, but I thought better of it and erased it. Let's just say that with the help of a very dear friend and with a little Yankee ingenuity and maybe even a little trickery, I was able to get away before my people knew it. And I arrived okay at my new station, which was a British airfield, completely run by the British. The only other Yank there were two other fellows like myself, sent there for flight control training. Otherwise, it was a completely British station run by the British, and it was called an operational training unit. And what its purpose was, they trained Canadian air crews on handling multi-engine aircraft. In other words, students fresh out of flight school, that was their next step to handle, in other words, bombers, multi-engine craft. So that was quite an experience too. In fact, this particular airfield was right at Shakespeare's hometown, Stratford-on-Avon. I used to go into the little wee kirk, you know, where his name was carved, etc. Very beautiful countryside. And of course, being one of the only Yanks around, that has had its advantages too. Anyway, each of us were assigned to a particular British duty officer, a regular flight control officer. Whenever he was on duty, well, I was on duty. And I worked very closely with him. I learned everything there was to know about an airfield. That is, about its equipment, you know, about the tower and the lighting equipment, all that sort of thing. Something about flying an aircraft, you know, what can happen, what does happen, and what you do when it does happen, etc. Well, after some time there, we were then sent to the school, which was at another location, of course, and it, again, was completely run by the British. It was a British installation, and the only Yanks there were this particular class training to be flight control officers. Now that, again, was, I don't even remember where it was, but again, it was beautiful countryside. And my particular segment of the class had a real ruddy, jovial, tubby top sergeant of the Royal Air Force as our instructor. He was a freckle-faced, real jolly fellow, and I guess you know I've always been a sort of a cut-up at times, you know, and I used to pull some of that in his classes, and he'd get so angry because, you see, this was a very concentrated class. It was only 5 weeks. And during this training, you had to learn something. You had to learn meteorology, navigation, signals, something about flying an aircraft. You know, in other words, you had to know what a pilot was doing, and then what your job was in relation to that, and so on. And oh, I forget what else. It was, like I say, in 5 weeks you had to learn all that, and you had to cram real hard. But anyway, this fella, I used to get such a kick out of him because at first he'd get violently angry, and then he'd break out. He couldn't help it. He'd break out laughing, and he'd just roar for about 2 minutes, and then he'd say, "All right, Mormon, you got to quit this or we'll never get through this course," and he'd still be laughing. But anyway, we became great friends, and it was kind of funny, too. In the British sergeant messes, they have civilian girls waiting on table. You know, they bring the plate to you with the food on it and that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, and as you know, everything was rationed in England. Meat was difficult to get, you know. But anyway, when we'd sit down to dinner or meal, I'd always kind of flirt with these girls, and of course, Yanks were in favor. Let's face it, they kind of took to us Yanks, you know. So I'd have my plate with the slab of beef and so on, and I'd eat it, and I'd usually sit next to the sergeant. And then if I was hungry and the beef was good, you know, I'd wink at the gal and say, "Hey, honey bunch, how about another shot of that beef, huh?" "Oh, yes, sergeant," you know, and right off with my plate. And this guy, as soon as she'd get back with another big slab for me, he'd say, "Hey, how about, may I have..." She'd say, "Now, Sergeant, you know better than that. Don't you know there's a war on?" And, oh, he used to look at me and he'd say, "You son of a so-and-so, you." And then he'd start laughing. He couldn't help it, as disappointed as he was. And, of course, really it was unfair. And I used to tell him later, you know, whenever I'd meet him in the pub or something, I'd always be sure and buy him a drink. And I'd say, "Hey, Sarge, geez, I'm sorry about those meals," you know. I say, "But, you know, I'm a growing boy, and if I have to have it, you know," well, then he'd start laughing all over again and call me a few names, you know. But anyway, that was a great experience, and it was very interesting. As part of our final examination, we had to individually go into an enclosed hut on the airstrip, on the airfield, and all we had was a telephone and a microphone. Now, we couldn't see out. There were no windows. So they'd send an aircraft aloft, and the telephone had me connected with the direction finding station. And they'd just give me reports on the direction of the aircraft. You know, the aircraft was off in somewhere in 180 degrees from here, or 90 degrees, or 45, or 30 degrees, or whatever. Well, then with the microphone, I'd have to tell that pilot how to fly to get him back to the field. In other words, what course to fly. Also, this direction finding station would tell me his altitude. And then it would also tell me what distance the craft was from the field. So what I had to do at the appropriate times, I had to instruct the pilot to start descending at a certain rate, so many feet per second, and when to start this. And then if he was coming down too rapidly, correct that, and at the same time giving him his magnetic direction to fly. And theoretically, I was supposed to bring him in right down on the runway, or at least till he could see it and land. And I might tell you that it went very well for me. After I did my little trick there, why, the pilot said, they have an English expression, I can't think of what it is now, but anyway, it meant right on, good work, and this sort of thing, you know. And of course that pleased me. And you also appear before some high Air Force brass, both American and British, and they question you. You have an oral examination in addition to all your written examinations. And all those three things put together, you know, tell whether you've made the grade or not. Now, during this course of training and studying navigation, of course, we couldn't go into that very deeply, like celestial navigation or anything, because that's a lengthy study all by itself. But all we could get into was dead reckoning navigation, where you did it visually by landmarks and various other few little things. But so in our course and in our training, we had to take 4 cross-country flights. And during these flights, we would have to navigate the aircraft. In other words, tell the pilot what course to fly. And sometimes one of those runs in particular brought you over a town that was always, it had hills around it, and it was always shrouded in low cloud. So you were really flying in cloud when you had to tell the pilot to let down, and you know, if you were right, we should be right over the heart of the town, see. Of course, the pilot knew the routes and all, you know what I mean. He wasn't going to crash into a mountain or a hill if we steered him wrong. But anyway, I always got an A on those trips. Now, I enjoyed doing that, and I think I did a good job, but there was something else that helped there. This pilot was a sergeant. I don't know if you know this or not, but some of the pilots in the British Air Force were sergeants. They weren't commissioned officers, they were flying sergeants. And that's what this fellow was, only he was a Scotsman. He was from Scotland. Real nice guy. And we became very close friends. In fact, we used to hit the pub together every night. And he was always my pilot. So I don't know to this day whether he just always gave me an A or, you know, or whether, in other words, we always got to where we were going like I said we should, but whether he steered his own course or mine, I'll never know, you know, but except where I could see visual landmarks, I'd know if I was, you know, on the beam or not, but, you know, as you're flying along, you'd have to give him corrections for wind and that sort of thing. But anyway, that was very enjoyable. And on one of those trips, we strayed too close to the coast, and of course the coast was very well guarded. There were areas always in a war zone, areas where you just don't fly over. I mean, friendly or not, they shoot and ask questions later, you know. And I guess we got too close to an installation or something, or the coastline, and we were in an old twin-engine, oh gosh, I forget what they even called them, but they were obsolete. Anyway, all of a sudden, these two Spitfires come roaring at us from the side. You know, one had a red propeller hub, the other one a bright yellow. And man, I thought they were going to crash right into us. One peels off and goes right over the top of us, the other one underneath. In other words, they're telling the guy, get back in, boy, you know. And when you're in the air, and they're traveling at the speed they are, and you're traveling at the speed you are, well, you know, you come together pretty doggone fast, faster than you'd realize. And, well, that was a little thrilling, very interesting. Of course, as you know, I passed the course, and we then went from the school back to our original British station, and then we went on duty again with that same flight control officer. And little by little, he would let me take it over. And then he'd simply observe, and I would control the aircraft. And incidentally, as you know, the British did all their bombing at night. And these crews, they did their training at night, too. They took off and landed those bombers at night. And I don't mind telling you there were a number of crashes, both on and off the field. Rather serious ones, because they were green air crew, and they had their problems. But gradually, when this officer thinks that you're capable of handling it all by yourself without him even being around, then you're certified. In other words, you get a card signed by the commanding officer of that station, and also signed by the officer you were working with, that in their opinion you are capable of handling a solo watch as a flight control officer. Well, then from there, the next step was to be commissioned. So we were sent to, I guess it was a replacement depot in north of England. You know, the famous ocean resort, Blackpool. Well, it was right near that. And, I must have been there a month or longer, and we had no duties. We were simply waiting to be commissioned. And believe it or not, my understanding, you know, I couldn't understand why we had to wait so long, but I found out later that they actually didn't have anybody there that knew the procedure for commissioning people in the field. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know. But anyway, eventually one day, I should say in the meantime, I was having the good life. I'd go down to Blackpool and lay on the beach, you know, and I could literally come and go as I pleased. Anyway, one day we were finally called in and sworn in as officers of the United States. At that time was United States Army Air Corps. It was not yet the Air Force, still part of the Army. So then, of course, as soon as we were commissioned, orders were already issued, so stating, and we were to proceed to London on so many days' leave to become equipped, to purchase uniforms, etc. And that's what we did. We went to London, bought officers' uniforms and so on, got rid of our enlisted togs. We were then, by act of Congress, by decree of the President of the United States, officers and gentlemen. And that was, you know, that was a good feeling. But I guess the best feeling was my orders then also read that after so many days, by such a date, I was to report back to 8th Air Force Headquarters for assignment. So, of course, that was the headquarters, I should say, from which I left to go to for this training. So, of course, it was quite a delight. I wasn't rubbing it in or anything, but it was a thrill for me, I should say, to arrive there, walk into that officer's bar, and step up to the bar and order a drink with all of my former bosses standing there. You know, my colonel and lieutenant colonel, my captains and majors, the whole works, the whole ordnance department was in there when I walked in. And of course, all of them except my colonel and his right-hand man, who had to stick with him, the lieutenant colonel, they all rushed around me and swamped me and shook my hand, congratulations, and bought me a drink, you know. But my colonel stood back in the corner there, you know, with his lieutenant colonel assistant. I just looked his way and he looked my way, and I didn't walk over to him or anything. But eventually, the thaw came and he walked over. They both did, and congratulated me. Now, before I left that officer's bar that night, and I didn't stay very long, the colonel and the lieutenant colonel had left. And one of the officers came to me, said, "I'd like to talk to you for a minute." I said, "Yeah." So he said, "Look, Colonel so-and-so," that was the guy that didn't like me, you know. He said he'd like to have you back as an ordnance officer, and if you come back, he can arrange it. He'll put you in charge of the vehicles. Like I told you, they used to be quartermaster, but ordnance then handle them. And I said, "Well, gee, I'm grateful for the offer," I said, "but after all, the Air Corps trained me to do a job, and I feel that I must stick with that. I must prove my worth there. I must repay them, and I think I owe them my allegiance." I said, "I would like to come back, but I don't think really it would be the right thing to do." So they must have relayed the message to the colonel. And of course, right away I was assigned I was given my assignment by orders to report to the headquarters of the 3rd Bomb Wing of the 8th Air Force. And of course, I immediately proceeded there. Now, when I arrived there, something was in the process. It hadn't yet happened, but something was in the process that this 3rd Bomb Wing, well, very shortly after I got there, let me put it this way, they formed another Air Force called the 9th Air Force. That was a tactical Air Force. And right in England, And this third bomb wing happened to deal with medium bombers. They were B-26 Marauders at that time. And I was put to work in the operations room. You know, it's a locked secret room where you have the big plotting table and the big charts on the wall, and you send the missions out. You know, and there's a lot to that. You have to do certain things. You have to notify certain Allied headquarters at such and such a time. In fact, you get in touch with the British Admiralty, for one thing. You tell them at such and such a time and at such and such a place, X number of this type of aircraft will be leaving the English coast, headed in such and such a direction. See, so the ships that they can warn the ships at sea not to shoot at them. See? In other words, they're friendly. Oh, and you have to arrange for diversion airfields in case your fields are become inoperative for some reason. Either somebody crashes or something happens right in the middle of the runways, or if the weather gets bad. That was a big thing in England, bad weather. You always had to have diversionary fields ready where the weather would permit the aircraft to land, and yet they couldn't be too far away because you had to consider the fuel consumption of the aircraft, how much fuel they would be likely to have left and how far they could go before they ran out and still land safely. So there was quite a bit to it. You had to notify the Royal Observer Corps. That was the people on land that always were looking out for enemy aircraft and so on. And you actually ran the mission. It was you that decided, would you divert and where would you send them and so on. And of course you had these fields all prepared to accept aircraft, and if you decided to divert, then of course you had to immediately get on the horn to those people and tell them that they're on the way, and then they're ready with food and blankets, emergency equipment, and quarters, and you name it, you know. And that was a very interesting job, and you know, on the plotting table, we had wax that, you know, with headsets. They'd keep getting reports. We could watch our aircraft, the progress. You know, they'd keep moving the little aircraft on the board, and there would be a tag to show their altitude. And then we could see when the enemy fighters would come up after them, then they'd start plotting them on the board, and we could see when they were over target, watch their progress coming back, etc. And we would know, you know, if any were in trouble and so on, to prepare for emergencies. And we always had emergency fields along the coast, because if an aircraft was crippled, they could sometimes make it to the coast and crash land if necessary. And also sometimes, because of a change in weather or something, we would have to break radio silence, order the mission to abort, either bring their bombs back or jettison them in the channel and so on. It was now, while all this fevered activity was in progress, I often had high generals standing right, touching my back, observing, you know. Today that would make me extremely nervous. Then it did not at all. I just went on about my business, did my job to the best of my ability. So anyway, after a few weeks, I guess it was, you're usually sent to a place like that third bomb wing or a bomber command headquarters in the operations room to get the lay of the land, to see what goes on, and then you may be sent out to a field, to a group to control their particular aircraft from the tower at the airfield. It depends. They decide that while you're there and observe you and so on. Well, in my case, I was transferred, I was transferred to an airfield, and where the chief flight control officer there was a captain. I would have been under him working a shift, you know. And of course they ordered a bomber to take me there, and I got in, and short order they got me over there, and I got out and with my gear went up into the quarters that were in the tower, just unpacking, and get a phone call. That is, my superior there gets a phone call, and whoever was calling said, did Lieutenant Mormon arrive? They said yes, and he says, in fact, he's in the process of unpacking right now. They said, well, hold him up. We're sending an aircraft for him. He's coming back. Incidentally, I hope you will understand some of these breaks in continuity, because I must confess, I get a little emotional sometimes thinking about this stuff, talking about it, because, oh, there were some good things, some bad things, but it brings back a lot, and it affects me a little bit sometimes, so I hope you'll bear with me. So anyway, I didn't know why the recall, but I got into the bomber and went back, and the captain that was the chief flight control officer, incidentally, I think by that time, or either it happened shortly after, that headquarters was elevated from a bomb wing of the one Air Force to a bomber command of another Air Force. See, that's a higher echelon headquarters, so we became a bomber command. And of course our responsibilities and so on increased. So anyway, when I got back, this captain told me, he said, I decided that I'm going to keep you here because in the short time you were here, you have shown me that you handle yourself like an old pro, and I need you here. So anyway, there's where I was assigned. The orders were changed. And then this captain had a secretary, a WAC sergeant secretary. And before I was ever sent out to that airfield, she came up to me one day. I was only there about 2 weeks. And she said, Lieutenant Mormon, how many years have you been doing this work? I said, years? I said, hell, I've just been graduated from the school, and this is my first assignment. I'm just here to observe, more or less, you know. She said, I don't believe it. I said, oh, yes, I'll show you, you know. She said, well, my God, you handle this damn place like you've been here for 3 or 4 years. So anyway, I consider that a pretty nice compliment, and you know, there was another duty we had there at that time because it was so early in the war. I should say, not that early maybe, but being a new headquarters and so on, and always constantly building new fields and making new commands, etc. Our airfields within that command at that time did not have their own system for detecting enemy aircraft in the area, so they could sound their air raid alarms for their people. So in the very beginning when I got there, see, we had a switchboard. When I was on duty, I was sitting up on a dais where I could observe everything in the room. I also had a switchboard. Oh, I don't know how many lines came into the thing, but quite a few. I was, you know, on one phone, lay it down on another one, lay it down on another one, all during the damn operation, you might say. And